be out that you can use, which is essentially this. If you can see, there are two. There is a document which we have put out called The Numbers Behind Climate Change. And we have done very detailed analysis looking at why equity and climate justice really is important for climate, for an ambitious and effective climate agreement. We also have a special issue of our magazine, Down to Earth, in which we have put forward a very detailed fact sheets on what is the agenda going forward. Now, both these documents we will make available so that you can use. But today, I think it is more important for us to explain these to you, and that is what we would hope to do in the next 2 hours we have. And of course, take a lot of the questions that you have for us. I'm going to ask my colleague Avantika Goswami to start to explain what is the agenda for COP. The Conference of Parties that meets in Glasgow beginning Monday. What is the agenda on the table? So the first idea is to give you what are the brass tacks of the agenda. I will then take over from Avantika after her presentation and explain to you what is CSC's position and what is it that we want done at COP. So, and then of course, I'm hoping we'll have a lot of questions from all of you. So Avantika, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much, Sunita-ji. Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Avantika. I work in the climate change program at CSC. And today I will be taking you through some of the key themes that will be discussed in Glasgow in less than a week from today. So as most of you and all of you are aware, COP26 will be held in Glasgow starting from November 1st. The underlying treaty that is administering and governing all of these deliberations is the Paris Agreement, which is an international treaty to cut greenhouse gas emissions and thereby limit global warming. And to do so, countries have provided voluntary targets called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which determine how they will reduce their emissions. In Glasgow, the parties to the Paris Agreement will meet to discuss how to proceed collaboratively on addressing climate change. But of course, the discussions take the role of negotiations rather than cooperation, as we will find out in the next few slides. India too has an NDC target. The primary target is to reduce its emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 compared to 2005. It has made considerable progress on this. It had already achieved 24% reduction by 2016. And it also has a non-fossil fuel energy goal as well as a goal associated with carbon sinks. So the meeting next month, the summit, is critical, even more so since the IPCC published its 6th assessment report in August of this year, which stated that every slight increase in global warming, every additional 0.5 degrees will lead to unprecedented heat extremes, extreme precipitation, and drought, and the impacts will be felt by all. So what are some of the key themes that will be discussed? So a snapshot is provided here, and some of these themes are embedded in the official agenda for COP26. Some of them are more of, elephants in the room, which are not formally spelled out, but will definitely influence the deliberations that go on at COP26. And out of these themes, 4 are particularly of interest to developing countries like India. The first being enhancing climate ambition through more ambitious NDCs. The second being climate finance. The third is adaptation. And the fourth is loss and damage. So the outcomes on these goals will definitely affect the future of developing countries like India. So moving ahead, going into the first key theme, enhancing climate ambition. So as per the rules of the Paris Agreement, NDCs are supposed to get progressively more ambitious every 5 years. This is called the ratcheting mechanism. And the countries were supposed to submit updated NDCs by December 2020. Most of them did not meet that deadline, but have continued to submit updated targets. As of 2 days ago, 116 countries submitted updated NDC targets. And these were assessed by the UNFCCC, which is the convention that governs the Paris Agreement. And the UNFCCC found that despite the new NDC targets, overall global greenhouse gas emissions will still be 16% higher in 2030 compared to 2010. This is when you look at this relative to what the IPCC prescribes, that we needed a 45% reduction in emissions in 2030 compared to 2010, we are far off from this goal. The current NDCs lead us to 2.7 degrees Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And all of this is despite the fact that major pledges were actually submitted by a number of countries this year. The US, the United Kingdom, the European Union have all submitted more ambitious NDCs. Of course, these are not within the fair share of emission reductions that they should undertake, but nonetheless, NDCs have been revised. Certain other major polluters like Russia and Australia have not shown enough ambition. And in fact, Russia's emissions are likely to rise despite the full achievement of its current NDC. And lastly, it's important for us to remember that these are simply pledges or promises. They do not equate to actual policies or change. So what will matter is what concrete plans countries put in place to realize their NDCs. One addition to this particular argument, so the Center for Science and Environment, we've undertaken analysis of 45 of NDCs of 45 countries. And we have found that if these 45 NDCs are fully achieved, then carbon dioxide emissions in 2030 will be about 37 gigatons compared to what the IPCC prescribes, which is 18.22 gigatons. And if emissions continue at current business as usual rates, emissions will be more than 40 gigatons in 2030, which is far surpassing the IPCC's level. So moving on to the next theme for discussion. So you've all heard all of the hype and excitement around net zero targets. What does net zero mean? Essentially, it means that any CO2 emissions that are released must be negated by an equal volume of CO2 absorbed. And this absorption is done through various means. So carbon dioxide can be absorbed by trees, forests, which are natural carbon sinks. CO2 can also be absorbed by technologies such as carbon capture and storage or direct air capture. But these technologies are still unproven at scale and they are very expensive. So the idea of net zero is that your volume of emissions released is cancelled out by the volume of emissions absorbed. And many countries have announced net zero targets, almost 65 countries as of a few days ago. The problem is that most countries have set a deadline to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or 2045, around that ballpark. And in our view, that is too little, too late. And what it does is it puts no pressure on countries to reduce emissions today, as long as they can bank on carbon absorption later in this century. So it buys them time to emit more. We also believe that developed countries must turn net zero much earlier than developing countries. So this includes countries in the global north, as well as China, which is a global superpower and a developed nation today. The other issue is that the net zero targets set by countries are either not accompanied by concrete plans, or they are accompanied by speculation on how much natural sinks will be able to absorb carbon in the future, or technologies will be able to do. And this speculation is not scientifically backed. So taking their net zero targets seriously right now is not really possible. Moving on to the next theme that's focused on coal. Coal is the most polluting fossil fuel. It constituted almost 40% of carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels in 2019. And according to the IPCC's prescription, in order to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is considered the safe level, coal has to be completely absent from the world's electricity mix in 2050. So absolutely zero coal. And some change has taken place. So the economics of coal have proved too expensive and too inefficient. So as a result, the global pipeline of coal has collapsed by 76% since 2015. The remaining pipeline is occupied mainly by countries in Asia, such as China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. Most of these countries are still, they still have some progress to make on their development journey, and hence they are dependent on coal. China, however, is not. China has immense renewable energy capabilities. And despite that, China alone contributed 50% of the world's CO2 emissions from coal in 2019 alone. Another angle of the coal debate is that many countries that have formerly been reliant on coal to advance themselves on the path to prosperity, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and even Russia, they have now switched over to natural gas, which is cheaper and more abundantly available. And natural gas is by no means a clean source of energy, yet these countries are pressuring developing countries to phase out coal. This is absolutely critical. Developing countries must reduce their dependence on coal, but this will require financial assistance to help them transition over into low carbon sources of energy. Here is a snapshot of the top emitters of carbon dioxide emissions from coal in 2019. Of course, India and China, with their massive populations, are at the top. But interestingly, third is the United States, which has reduced its coal use to a great extent in the past decade and a half due to the shale oil boom, due to the shale gas boom, my apologies. But still, it still has coal consumption and does not have a date to phase out coal use. Other countries such as Japan, South Africa, Russia, and South Korea are also major consumers of coal, and none of them have a target date to phase it out. Within the European Union, Germany has the largest coal fleet, but it has set a date of 2038 to phase out the use of coal. And depending on Germany's internal politics, that date could be brought forward to 2030 as well. The next issue that will, as I had mentioned earlier, it will have an outsized influence on the deliberations that go on at COP26 is the role of China. China was formerly a developing country, but between 1990 and 2019, in a very short span of time, it increased its share of global carbon dioxide emissions from 5% to more than 20%. Our analysis suggests that China will emit another 126 gigatons of carbon dioxide in this decade itself. And in doing so, it will occupy 30% of the remaining carbon budget. China recently announced that it will no longer build coal-fired power projects abroad, but its domestic coal fleet is still massive and it is still growing. So China's total installed coal capacity is estimated currently at 1,050 gigawatts in 2020, which is about half of the global total. And in 2020 alone, China put more coal-fired power capacity into operation, much more than was put in anywhere else in the world. The paradox here is that China is also one of the leaders in renewable energy, both in terms of its own capacity as well as in the global renewable production supply chain. But despite its massive renewable energy plans for the future, China must curb its coal power production in order to achieve its goal of carbon neutrality by 2060. So that is going to be key. And overall, for the world to achieve the Paris Agreement's goal, China must reduce its demand for coal to nearly zero by 2050 rather than increase it. The next theme that is going to come up at COP26 is refers to the rules around carbon markets. So a carbon market is an arrangement where emissions are traded between countries or corporations. For example, when a country reduces its emissions through a particular intervention, it generates carbon credits, and these can be sold to another country for a certain price per ton of carbon. The rules for carbon markets are summarized in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. They were unresolved at COP25 in Madrid, and there is pressure to finalize them now at COP26. Under the Paris Agreement, carbon market instruments are of two types. Article 6.2 calls to establish bilateral carbon markets like the European Union's emissions trading system. Article 6.4 is known as the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which aims to establish a new international carbon market, which is essentially a new avatar of the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. A number of open issues remain. How will double counting be handled? That is, if a country sells credits to another, do the emission reductions count for both in terms of their climate goals? And how will they be counted considering the NDCs are not designed in a standardized format across countries? Should leftover credits from the Kyoto Protocol be carried over, when doing so would flood the new market with cheap credits and mask any real effort to cut emissions? And how can adaptation be financed from the proceeds of a new carbon market? So these and other questions still remain open. It is also true that the developing world needs financing for low carbon development, but in the past, funding has gone to the lowest cost options that did not reduce emissions much. So any new agreement on carbon markets must be used for investment in high cost and transformational sectors so that economies can be re-engineered for the future challenges that lie ahead. Moving on, the next theme, and this is particularly critical to India, is the issue of climate finance. According to the Paris Agreement, developed countries had pledged that $100 billion per year would be transferred to developing countries to aid low carbon development. This was to begin in 2015 and continue till 2025 annually, after which the amount would be revised upwards. But of course, this goal has not been met, and a recent estimate suggests that it will not be fulfilled till 2023. There are a number of issues with the data around climate finance. The data is extremely complex and it lacks transparency. It is also interpreted differently by different interest groups. So in many cases, regular development aid is counted as climate aid, and that sort of murks the waters in the accounting of climate finance. It is also important to stress that the $100 billion amount did not reflect the actual needs of developing countries. To implement their NDCs, developing countries need 5.8 to 5.9 trillion up to 2030, according to the Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC. Also, most of the aid currently transferred, the finance currently transferred, is in the form of loans and is financing climate change mitigation projects. This needs to be balanced out. There needs to be, of course, the majority should be in the form of grants and not loans. But in terms of the split of the type of finance, it needs to be equally balanced between mitigation and adaptation needs as well. Adaptation is currently not being prioritized adequately. On a related note, the global goal on adaptation is enshrined in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. Given the increasing severity of extreme weather events as the climate crisis worsens, the costs of adaptation have outpaced the current flow of financing to developing countries to deal with the adaptation challenges. The United Nations Environmental Programme's Adaptation Gap Report found that the adaptation finance gap is far from closing. And current estimates in developing countries for adaptation costs are in the range of 70 billion US dollars, but they could reach 280 to 500 billion dollars by 2030. In 2020 alone, economic losses due to weather-related disasters were in excess of $200 billion. And most of this went uninsured and unprotected. So financing for adaptation must be centered in the agenda at COP26. And the countries most in need of this lie in the global south. A related but also an independent issue in its own right is the issue of loss and damage. Loss and damage essentially provides compensation to the victims of climate-related extreme weather events and disasters, particularly when they are countries who have historically contributed very little to global greenhouse gas emissions and thus to the climate crisis. Currently, there's no agreed definition of loss and damage. The Paris Agreement refers to both extreme weather events as well as slow onset events like the melting of glaciers. The Paris Agreement also mentions that currently legal compensation or liability cannot be claimed by parties in the event of loss and damage. A number of vehicles have been put in place, such as the Warsaw International Mechanism, most recently the Santiago Network, to address the issue of loss and damage, but progress in terms of actual tangible funds transferred for this has been extremely low. So COP26 must make loss and damage a permanent agenda for discussion, and compensation must be committed in a scaled up fashion to the affected countries and communities. And finally, the last theme that we will discuss is the issue of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions have been discussed for over a decade and a half at this point, but essentially they refer to any initiatives that leverage the strengths of natural ecosystems to address climate change. This could be in terms of using nature to address climate adaptation or to address climate change mitigation. There are a number of terms that are associated with this. Another commonly used term is natural climate solutions when referring to the ability of natural ecosystems to absorb carbon emissions. One of the major reasons that natural ecosystems have come in focus, especially recently once the conversations around net zero started off, one of the main reasons is that land-based natural ecosystems act as carbon sinks. And many estimates have suggested that enhancing these natural sinks will lead to a greater absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and thereby address the ongoing climate crisis. Of course, financing for this is required, and currently there is about a $4 trillion financing gap to enhance natural ecosystems to the degree required for the current level of global warming. However, the potential that natural solutions offer for climate change mitigation is quite significant. A study by the World Economic Forum suggests that nature-based solutions or natural ecosystems can deliver up to 30% of the emissions reduction needed to achieve the IPCC's 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of 2050. And this comes in various forms. It could be through avoided deforestation, peatland restoration, reforestation, and so on. And these are low-cost options, meaning that their costs are much lower than technological solutions like carbon capture and storage. So they are, in a way, a low-hanging fruit to address climate change, and they come with multiple co-benefits in terms of enhancing livelihoods of communities, diversifying food production sources, and so on. The problem arises, however, when nature-based solutions get linked to carbon offsets, where a particular country or emitting party is releasing emissions and then it purchases carbon offsets to offset those emissions. The funding for that goes towards various nature-related projects. It could be towards reforesting a particular area, for example. But this has a number of issues associated. What this does is it masks any real effort that the country or entity would take to reduce its own emissions. Nature-based solutions can also not be treated as a substitute for emissions reductions, because nature, even if it's maxed out to its maximum potential, cannot offset the vast scale of fossil fuel emissions we have released cumulatively into the atmosphere. Another issue is that most of the focus tends to be on tropical forests in the global south, because tropical forests are the largest carbon sinks in the world, and hence the greatest potential for reforestation lies in these areas. But the problem with doing that is that forests are under threat from fires, deforestation, and from climate change itself. Tropical forests are also home to indigenous communities that depend on them for food and livelihoods. The interesting part is that the same international business and trading interests who are today citing nature-based solutions as the next silver bullet for climate change are often complicit in deforestation themselves. 1/3 of the tropical deforestation that takes place today is due to international trade. So nature-based solutions cannot be advocated without addressing the very parties who are responsible for the destruction of these natural ecosystems. Any future negotiations on the role of forests and nature as a climate solution must do a couple of things. They must preserve intact forests, and secondly, they must enhance existing natural ecosystems in a way that resilient livelihoods of the communities living there are preserved and their land rights are preserved. So any solution in the future must be a win-win for both forests as well as people. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Avantika, that's excellent. And I hope all of you found it useful. Before I open up for questions, what I'm going to do is to jump right in and give you a quick summary of the work that we have done recently on the carbon budget and the imperative of equity. I'll also talk a little bit about, from Avantika's presentation, I will tweak out for you what are then our asks for COP. And of course, what is the agenda that we would like to set aside for India? And I will look forward to obviously a lot more questions on that. Both Avantika and I will be open for questions as we speak. So Jayanto, I saw that you have your hand up. Can you just forgive me? I'm going to go ahead and do this presentation and then take all the questions that everyone has. So just give us give me 10 minutes. I will run through this very quickly and then open this out. Now, the first thing is that, as I told you, we have these two documents, and please do take a look at them. We have very good information available as both background research, but also in terms of positions and data to move ahead. More importantly, this booklet that we have done on the numbers behind climate change is very important because for once it puts together all data on the emissions, current and future of countries. It also puts together what are the NDCs of different countries, what will be the trajectory of the country's growth between now and 2030. And then, of course, we have looked at the issue of the carbon budget, both historical, current, and future. So this is really what I want to talk about. And for CSC, the first agenda that we want to put on the table at COP is the imperative of equity. Now, we say this because in the Paris Agreement, and by the time the world met in Paris in 2015, the very idea of equity was actually demolished. The Paris Agreement does not include historical emissions at all, and it uses climate justice as a postscript. And every other part of the agreement in which, say, loss and damage, the issue of liability and compensation is removed. And the entire agreement is based on saying, let every country act and it'll all add up. Now, the fact is, this is just not going to be the solution for climate change. And this is the point that we want to put on the table and make it as clear as possible that we need to be able to address this as we go forward. I think Jayantar has something very urgent to say. Suparno, can you unmute him and ask him? Is there something really urgent? Or can I continue? So Kanya?
Ma'am, I have unmuted him. Now he can just unmute
Jayanta, is
himself.
there something very urgent?
No, Sunita, please go ahead. I've just kind of put my presence felt. Please go ahead, and after that I'll ask.
Thank you, Jayanta.
Thank you. Sorry to bother.
Thank you, Jayanta. So the reason why equity is such an imperative is for three key reasons. One, gases have a long residence time in the atmosphere. So you cannot just say that that history does not matter. You can't wipe out history because the cumulative emissions are still in the atmosphere. And these actually are what are creating climate change today. But the second most important issue is that we know that CO2 emissions are also linked to economic growth. I mean, we want a different future. We are environmentalists. We are fighting for a different low carbon future in India. But we also know that the reality of the world, and as Avantika has just shown you, coal has been part of the reason why countries have reached the point of prosperity today. It continues to be an important part of the energy future, even in the most developed world. And we know, therefore, CO2 emissions are linked to economic growth. And so when we look at these discussions, it is not just about sharing atmospheric space, but also growth. The third, and I think this is the most critical part why Paris Agreement is actually irrelevant today. It may have wiped out the notion of equity, but it cannot do so in the reality of the world. The fact is, the emerging world, our world, still needs space to grow. And as we grow, we will add to the emissions. And that 1.5 degree Celsius guardrail will then be lost. So we need to understand that you cannot, unless the world is saying that, let's wipe out 66% of the world population, just let's erase them from the world. The fact is their growth will add to the jeopardy. So we need to talk about growth differently. We need to talk about what is the framework of equity which will make that growth transformation happen differently. So if you look at current emissions and this booklet that we have put together, plus Down to Earth, we put all these numbers together for you because it's important for us to understand the hard numbers behind the politics. Climate change is about politics, but it is about science, and the science is determined by numbers. Current emissions are about 36.4 gigatons of CO2. These are CO2 from cement and fossil fuel only. If you look at the data, you will see that today, if you look at this, and in our Down to Earth and in the booklet, we have done a color coding. Red is China, of course, but this yellow or orange is the 7 historical polluters who are UK, US, EU 27, Russia, Japan, Australia, Canada. Just look at their contribution until 2019, just see how dominant they were in the world. And then see from 2000, which Avantika talked about, the role of China, just see. And this coincides with China joining WTO. And just look at the huge spike of emissions that are there today. So these countries, what we are calling the 7 past and China, emit 50% of the emissions. Africa, with 17% of the world population, emits about 4%, and of which South Africa is actually the major. And India, with 17% of the world population, is 7%. If you look at the sheer numbers, because there's a lot of talk about India, and rightly so. India is a big country, and India's emissions are today the 3rd largest or the 4th largest. If you take EU, they become the 4th largest. If you don't take EU as a group, they're the 3rd largest. But just look at the difference. Just look at this. China has 10 gigawatts. US is 5 gigawatts, and India is 2.92 gigawatts of CO2 annually in 2019. So the scale, I mean, it's time the world dehyphenated India from China. That's the point that Avantika was making. That's the point we are making very clearly. We need to get China's long game revealed. And we need to understand how the lumping together of China as part of G77 or India and China is actually missing the plot. Look at this. 28% of the emissions in 2019 were China. 34% were from what we are calling the 7 industrialized past polluters. And the rest of the world had 31%, India 7%. So the sheer magnitude must be something that we must understand. We can't, we often talk about this and we say, "Arey, ye to past ki baat hai." Why are we talking about per capita? Why are we talking about? So don't talk about per capita. Per capita is something that the Western media always doesn't want to talk about. They say, because you have too many people in your country. Fine. Let's look at the quantum. Let's look at the quantum. And if you look at the quantum, then you must be on a different planet if you believe that India and China are on the same plate. If you look at per capita, the injustice is, it's appalling. We put here how much one US and what it does in terms of China, South Africa, India, Ethiopia. And this data is available on our website in the booklet, and you can take a look. I just want to make the point that you can't erase this. You can't just say, no, this is all finger pointing. And even if we made the mistakes in the past, you don't make it in the future. I mean, that's the whole narrative of the Western media, of the Western countries. We need to be able to understand the reality and the hard facts before we can actually move ahead. And this is why we put together this. We have said very clearly, this is not to finger point, but it is to stop the finger pointing as we move ahead. Now, Avantika has already made this point, but I want to be able to explain to you that our data shows very clearly that the NDCs do not add up. And if you look at it, this is the data from the countries and the nationally determined contributions that they have set. And this is why the Paris Agreement really is an agreement which has destroyed the ability of the world to move at scale and at speed, because it dilutes the principle of equity. It dilutes the principle of determining action based on responsibility. It is basically based on saying, do what you can and let's see how the world adds up. It doesn't add up. All data shows that we will cross every threshold of safety, and the world is definitely en route to at least a 3-degree or more temperature rise. And remember that the NDCs also, and I will show you, are also highly inequitable and not ambitious. So the data is very clear. The carbon budget that remains is only about 400 gigaton. And what you are very clear about is that in the BAU scenario or the NDC scenario, both of them, this budget is exceeded. 386.80 is the carbon budget that remains, because out of the 400 gigatons that you have to remove from it the forests or the LULUCF contribution. So it's basically 386. Now, the point that I want to make and we want to make here is that the world can't go to Glasgow and gloss over all this. It cannot go to Glasgow and think that this is all hunky-dory, that what the world has done up till now is fine, and that now it's the time of the emerging world to be able to act. Our data also shows, and we have done a lot of work looking at other countries like Botswana and South Africa, many countries of Africa, and you will find what is bizarre is the fact that these countries have actually committed to emission reduction, which will take their already extremely low contribution of per capita emissions to even lower levels. And it's really a question of, is this even possible? Is this even possible for these countries to do? And then if you read the fine print, you find out that many of these countries have said that this is conditional. We will do it if we get finance or technology, but that finance and technology is just not happening. And so the world actually is consigned today to the fact that emissions are going to rise and rise at a point when it is unsustainable. So the next part of what we did was to look at the historical contribution of countries, the cumulative till now. And then we have looked at what will be the future. But first, let me tell you what is the scenario between 1870 to 1989. We've called this period before the climate convention. If you look at it beyond the climate convention, then you essentially get a very clear fact that the bulk of the emissions belong to the 7 historical polluters. Look at the table here, and you will find that percentage of the total emissions for what we call before the climate convention. This is the percentage of the countries, and they added up to 76.66%. Then came the post-China period, okay, which is 2000 onwards. We've got the data for 1990 to 2019. Look at the second chart, how the scenario changes. China is 20%, 20.72% of the emissions in that period, and it grows from 5.11 to 20%. But if you look at the overall, between 1870 to 2019, then you still have a scenario in which the 7 historical polluters are 60%, China is 13%, India is 3%, India was 4% in the 2 decades, but its contribution in the past up to 1989 was minuscule. So it still only occupies 3.16% of the space, atmospheric space in terms of cumulative emissions, and the rest of the world 22%. We have put here India in terms of emissions, South Africa, South Korea, Brazil, Vietnam. And it's important for us to understand, therefore, what is the quantum of emissions and what is the inequity up till now. But this is the past. The question is, will this change in the future? You have NDCs now. You have countries saying they're going to do reduction. You have President Biden who has put a 50% reduction goal. You have many others who are also saying that they will reduce. Some of the top countries, the 7 big ones, have put emission reduction targets. So will the future change? Not really. If you look at this, we have put data here of 2020 to 2030. Focus on this. The world will emit in the NDC scenario 409 gigatons, of which China will be 30%. The 7 historical polluters will be still 27%, and the rest of the world will get 31%. So, and India will be 9% or about 9.5%. Okay. Then if you take the overall from 1870 to 2030, you basically see that this injustice has not gone away. It's actually become a climate apartheid. It's become solidified in this period. And this then is important for you to see from a per capita. I showed you the per capita of 2019. Now compare the per capita for 2030. What is fascinating to see is if you look at the US, and this is US after its 50% reduction, it'll go from its current 16 tons per capita per year to 9.4 tons. China will increase from 7 to 9. So actually you see an equality between China and the US. And then if you start looking at India, it'll go from 1.9 to 3. You look at South Africa with its reduction target will actually come down from 8.2 to 4.7. Now, South Africa can do this in a way that it can provide energy to very large numbers of its very poor people. I think that's very commendable. And then, of course, if you look at the rest, it's minuscule. This is what the picture is. We've also put together data here on the carbon budget, how much of the budget will be exhausted and what will be the share of the carbon budget. I'm sorry, I'm just getting too many people trying to enter, so I'm struggling to show you this. But if you look at this, we have put the percentage of the IPCC budget, the carbon budget, and how much of it will get used by which country. Important to understand this because it's important to understand why equity matters. And this then is the final data that we have put together on the appropriation of the world emissions. Take a look at the yellow or the orange. This is the 7 historical. Look at China. This is from 1870 to 2030. Look at India from 3.16 to 4.44. Look at the rest of the world from 13.40 to 24.69. This is This is the reality of climate change. When leaders meet at Glasgow, they cannot gloss over this. They must not be allowed to gloss over this. Okay. So what then becomes the agenda for COP26? And I just want to reiterate what Avantika said. So the first for us is to put climate justice back on the table. Don't try and dilute it or erase historical emissions as was done in the Paris Agreement. We know today the reality is that vast numbers of people, almost 70% of the world population, will need access to carbon space for development. They cannot be told not to grow. So the question is, how will this growth happen without CO2 emissions? This should be the biggest question in front of Glasgow, not to berate and bully the poor, but actually talk about how this transformation will happen so that growth can happen without emissions. This is actually a repeat of the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, which had CBDR enshrined in it and said very clearly that the principle would be that the rich would reduce so that they would make space for the poor to grow, but that the poor could grow differently because they would be enabled by technology and finance. Technology and finance did not happen. China grew. And so whatever was the available space has now been exhausted. But the reality is the rest of the world will still need space to grow. And this will only further jeopardize the world. The second part of the agenda that we believe is that China has to be on the spotlight. It has not given any CO2 reduction targets. It will take up 33% of the remaining carbon budget. And we really believe that India needs to be dehyphenated from China, and China needs to be dehyphenated from G77. But the reality of the world also is that China is yesterday's United States. And we don't believe that there will be a lot of pressure on China, or can be a lot of pressure on China, to be able to really cut down its emissions. We have taken in our fact sheet, and please take a look at our fact sheet on China. You will find one very interesting fact, that China's non-fossil fuel energy generation is actually lower than even the India's today. And it's important for us to call this out, because we know that in China, it's very difficult to have, to get these facts out. And it's very difficult for the world to call out China. But it's important for us to put this on the table. The third part of the agenda we are saying is stop focusing on net zero, but focus on emission reduction by 2030. We need to front load the emission reductions of the 7+1 so that there is space for the rest to grow. This is what the focus at COP should be, not net zero and trying to bring together all countries on an agreement, which actually means nothing. The fourth part, as Avantika said, finance is crucial, but even more crucial than the quantum of money is the transparency and the measurement of how much money is given. It's really ironic that we are always told that transparency is important. But when it comes to the one indicator that we need, which the developed countries or the rich countries have to actually develop and be used by the rest of the world, this is the weakest indicator. This can't be measured. The difference between what OECD says and what the Oxfam report on finance says is a world of money which has to be explained. Huge differences. So we need clear measures, measurement tools to be able to verify that the finance is actually being provided. The fifth part of the agenda that we are putting on the table is that we want the market-based instrument to be used for transformational action and not for cheap carbon credits. Same for nature-based solutions that Avantika explained to you. Very important, because right now the world is looking for cheap ways to be able to reduce emissions, but it can't. Today, the entire world has taken on emission reduction targets. We need not to sell our cheapest options, low-hanging fruit, but actually invest in transformational action. This is where the market must work. The world should actually talk about a floor price for carbon so that we can make sure that nothing is done, nothing is in the market which is actually cheap and does not lead to that long-term change. Loss and damage, the most important, crucial debate in a world which is devastated by climate change. Today, scientists can even attribute each event to climate change. They can tell you that if the floods happened in Uttarakhand, how much of it can be fingerprinted to the impact of climate change. Even then, we have an agreement post-Paris which says that compensation or liability cannot be attributed to the discussions on loss and damage. Loss and damage has become an empty document. So has the question of an adaptation goal. If you look at the adaptation goal, then all the UNFCCC is doing is to set up committees and committees and committees and funds without money. And what we have said in our introduction is that our position is that the UNFC negotiations are happening almost as the people in those negotiations are working from a different planet. They don't understand the reality and the urgency of climate change. What then should be the agenda for India? Very quickly, India is the fourth largest contributor, third largest without EU27. But as I said, the quantum of historical, current, and even future is not comparable to big polluters in the world. But the reality of the world is that the world has run out of carbon budget and it has run out of time. Also, we are victims of climate change. We are most vulnerable. We will suffer. We are already seeing huge impacts on the very poor in our world. So act on climate change is the order of the day. We need to act, not because of the contribution in the past, but because it is in our self-interest. Our climate strategy has to be based within a framework of co-benefits. When we work in India, we look at thermal power plants. We want thermal power plants to become clean. We want coal use to be reduced in small boilers because they lead to massive air pollution problems. All that will also bring us climate change benefits. So that's the co-benefit approach that we need to have. So India needs a strategy for climate change mitigation based on co-benefits. We need a low carbon strategy for every sector. We need to measure and count the difference. We need to come up with what we will do in our own self-interest. And we need to talk about what are those options that are too expensive for us to invest. And that's the use of the market-based instrument that we would like to call upon the world, that they will fund. So we need to account, measure, and act. We are not saying that equity is a reason for India not to do so, but we are telling the world that without taking into account equity and the need for transformational action, we will never be able to combat climate change. Thank you very much. So, Supernova, will you now moderate? Supernova?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, let me just, my video is a little, yes.
We had, Jayanto was first.
So we can begin with
Maybe
Jayanto.
Jayanto can start. I saw Kalpana had a hand up.
Yes.
And then we can continue. Jayanto?
So Kanya, can you unmute him, please?
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, Jayanto.
Thank you. I think thanks Sunita and Avantika for wonderful presentations. Extremely useful, I think, for most who will be covering the COP. I have three very, very quick points. One is that Sunita is a leaders summit. On November 1 and 2, there's going to be the leaders summit, almost in line of the Paris one. I really would like to know from you that you feel that that will be useful in context to the overall emission reduction, kind of what the steps to be taken, or it's just being a more of a glamorized photo for the most leaders who need some photo of in other way. So that's my first question, the leaders summit, what is going to happen on that? Second is loss and damage. Avantika pointed out the main issues concerning India and other developing countries, and she mentioned loss and damage. But loss and damage is still being clubbed with adaptation. You just have pointed out how important loss and damage is. So if loss and damage remains clubbed with adaptation, will actually serve any purpose in the long run? or it will? So that is my second question. And third is another very important point you raised about China. Now, China, as you said, 28% contributing 28% of the emission. Now, by kind of with this basic structure in place, China, do you feel is piggybacking on other developing economies and being kind of taking shelter on that? Or should it be India's advantage to remain with China in the global negotiation? How we should deal with China, despite the fact China is contributing so much? That's the three.
Excellent questions. Avantika, should I take them?
Please, yes, definitely.
So, first leaders summit. I think it's very important, Jayanto. I think the world leaders need to come together in person and to put climate change on the world agenda. The fact is we have lost 2 years because of COVID. And in these 2 years, we have seen the extreme weather events increase. We have seen horrendous impacts on the rich and the poor of the world. We know that climate change is going to only get worse with every temperature degree rise or point temperature degree rise. So I think it's important for the world leaders to meet. I think it's also a good change, the world meeting before the summit, before the COP, because they need to set the tone for the COP to meet, for the COP to discuss. So in that sense, I think it's a good framing. Now, will they actually do their job that is required to be done? Will they actually call out the need for this transformational action? Will they call out the need for looking at climate justice as the bedrock of moving ahead? I'm not sure. I think the United States has definitely moved ahead. I mean, the US till Paris was the single biggest problem and the most regressive country when it came to climate action. The US has moved ahead, but today there is another US on the table, China. Now, whether this can be called out, whether there will be a very strong action moving ahead, or whether they will be, whether the leaders are simply going to come and do nothing, is something to be seen. But I think it is a call for action. I think it is a very, very tough time that the world has in front of it, looking ahead. And it is also linked to the insecurities in the world. The fact is, every time there is a cyclone, every time there is extreme rain or extreme or a cloud burst, it leads to devastation in the homes of the very poor. Their insecurity is added to the insecurity of nations. It adds to the crisis of migration. It then adds to the crisis of poverty and marginalization. So I think it's important that they're meeting, Jayanto. I don't know what they will do, but I think currently the narrative is very much, as you will see, the narrative is all about net zero. It's all about some sort of very poorly framed narrative for the future. So the question will be, how loud will the voices, particularly of Southern media, be to be able to correct some of these narratives? The second is the issue of loss and damage. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think it's a tragedy in the world that we have destroyed the conversation on loss and damage. And the fact is that it is clubbed with adaptation goal. But if you read the adaptation goal also, Jayanto, you will see there is nothing there. I mean, I spent with my colleagues some time looking at what does the world want to do with the adaptation goal. It's actually forming committees, forming networks, putting out information. There's nothing there. I think, and as I write in my beginning opener in Down to Earth, I really am saying that, these negotiations have become so ossified, so completely removed from reality, that we need to understand that, the reality of the world is that the losses are mounting and the damages are mounting and they need to be compensated. And just by holding up the Paris Agreement and saying that, oh, we have told you that we are not liable for this, is not going to make the reality go away. So I think loss and damage should be one of the top agendas moving forward. And I hope that, voices from the South will actually add weight to this and put it out much more clearly. The The third is China. And I think that's a very, very, very difficult question because yes, China is all countries have hidden behind China, group of 77. And China has really played a long game by exceeding everybody's emissions and doing it with such stealth that today it is occupying the bulk of emissions of 2019 and will continue to do so till 2030. The question is going to be, what is the framework so that a new China is not born tomorrow? And that is why it is important for the world to go back to the Kyoto Protocol framing, to go back to the framing that was done in the past to say, let's look at a way in which we can say which country has to take hard action. Is it going to be based on the quantum of emissions? Is it going to be based on a quantum of emissions along with GDP, HDI? What is it going to be? Now, this is the reason why China needs to be center stage, because if it's China today, it'll be India tomorrow, it'll be South Africa day after. We need a global guidance to make sure that the actions on climate change are driven on the basis of contribution to the problem. And this is why the Paris Agreement is so devastatingly bad for the world. Okay, Suparno? I think you're on mute, Suparno. Kalpana has a hand up. Jayashree has a hand up.
Yeah,
Kalpana,
so
please go ahead.
Yeah. So Kanya, can you unmute her, please? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Sunita. As usual, very clear and lucid presentation. Actually, I almost had a sense of deja vu listening to you.
I know.
Because it almost sounds like we are in 1992.
Yeah.
But we are actually in 2021. Anyway, my question is more specifically about India and the Indian government's position, because I'm not able to understand what is their position on net zero, because that's going to be the thing that's going to be pushed really hard in Glasgow by the other countries. And has the Indian government actually articulated any view? Because in the media, certainly, Jayaraman's article today and Raghu's article a few days ago are all arguing against net zero, but are people in government reading these, including what Down to Earth is putting out? Or are they going to play politics as they always do and decide on their position accordingly? And the other thing I want to ask you is on the nature-based solutions, which obviously is the thing that we should push for our own best interest,
Yeah.
And yet we know already from the policies that have been put in place in the last years that that is a very low priority for this government. Think of what is happening in Chhattisgarh and many of these other places where the interests of the people who would benefit from a nature-based solution is not a priority.
Yeah.
So my question is really twofold. One is, how is it possible even to push the Indian government to anywhere near what you and others are suggesting on the net zero? Have they been responsive? What do you think is going to be their ultimate position in Glasgow? And secondly, realistically, do you really think, apart from the rhetoric, is this government really going to put in place policies on nature-based solutions that really benefit, that are really win-win for communities as well as the environment?
Very good questions again, Kalpana. And yes, it's deja vu. I mean, I sometimes, I hear the voices of the young activists, climate activists today, and I'm always asked, and I'm, what I feel about it. And I'm really impressed, because the young climate activists from all over the world, and it's not just, I find they are able to articulate the problem of climate change also from the point of view of climate justice, also from the point of view of development. And I think we somehow over the last 30 years, and I put myself in this, that, we worked very hard to try and bring the issue of equity, climate justice onto the discussions on climate change. But frankly, the world just did not accept it. And that is why today, when we are sitting back, we're looking back and saying, we've lost such crucial decades. where we could have acted, and we could have acted with the same principle that we are talking about today, that we need transformational action in the South, but that this will demand money and technology, and we need to come up with the framing on how this will be done, and not another cheap, convoluted development mechanism, market-based instrument, not look at nature-based solutions as carbon sticks and ways in which low-cost options can be exercised by the richest countries, but actually meaningful action so that we can have true win-win. But I mean, I don't know how to respond more to that, Kalpana, to say, yes, I do feel the same sense of deja vu and a certain sense of almost dejection that we have lost so much time. To answer your two specific questions, one on net zero. Now, I don't know what the Indian government position is, but as I've also been reading in the press, the Indian government has said that net zero is not something that they think is the right way to move ahead. They have said very clearly that they also think net zero is inequitable, because the IPCC says that the world must move to net zero by 2050, which means the rich world must move by 2030. Net zero is also about appropriation more of the climate, of the carbon budget. But worse, net zero doesn't really have a real plan. Now, if India was to declare a net zero target, let's say, what would India do? India would certainly not say that it can do net zero like China by 2060. China is way ahead. I mean, 10 gigatons versus India's 2.5 gigatons. I mean, where is the comparison? So obviously India would say it will do net zero in 2070. What does it even mean? So I think this whole narrative on net zero has been a hijacking of urgent climate action by countries, and it has really diluted the need to act by 2030. Now, that is CSC's position. What will Indian government do? Will the Prime Minister, when he goes on the first, declare a net zero target? Is something that we will have to wait to hear. We have not seen any written statement by the Indian government that I can call upon to say this is what their policy will be. But I hope that they will urge the world not to focus on net zero, but to focus on 2030 and the need for urgent action. Now, as far as nature-based solutions are concerned, actually, Kalpana, this is a work that Avantika and I would like to continue to do after COP as well, because we are very concerned at this whole framing of what is called nature-based solutions and forests as sinks, because we are not yet being able to understand whose forests are these, and how do you make the forest offset program actually real and rigorous, but also one that benefits poor communities. And this is not just about India, Kalpana, it's actually about setting global rules. And the global rules right now, if you look at the McKinsey report for the World Economic Forum, the report makes it very clear that the reason they would push for nature-based solutions is because these are the cheapest options for carbon dioxide abatement. Now, if that's the driver for taking action, you will look for cheapest carbon abatement option in forests. Then you don't look at the question of the cost of land, the cost of labor, whose land is it? How do they benefit from it? What trees should be grown? So nature-based solution actually could work against even every principle of biodiversity. So it's a very important discussion to have going forward. As yet, the discussions on this are actually extremely difficult to even understand. It's difficult to even understand the science of sinks, how much of the sinks are sequestering carbon dioxide. What is the potential today? What will be the potential tomorrow? In whose lands are these sinks? What are the rules that are getting framed so that the rules actually enable and benefit local communities? So there is a long way to go in this. And my fear, Kalpana, is that the world is today in this mad crisis mode. Do something, do something. And instead of doing something which is meaningful on the fossil fuel front, there will be some meaningless action which will hit the interests of the very poor in the developing world. So I think we need to understand this better and to be open and much more participative in the discussions on how net zero will work with carbon sinks and what does carbon sinks mean. Okay, Jayashree. And then I have Simran. Sorry, Avantika, I'm hogging all the space. You want to jump in, please do.
Also, Neil Kamal is there. He had raised a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take
Okay.
Jayashree, Simran, and then I'll take Neil.
Yes, so Sunita, I wanted to ask, I had heard Mr. Kerry say that, okay, if India will help India in whichever way possible to achieve the 450 gigawatt renewable energy goal. And then yesterday, Mr. Alok Sharma also said that if they come and announce this 450 gigawatt goal as part of the NDC, that will be perfect. So I wanted to understand why does this put us on a 1.5 degree compatible pathway, and does it make us sort of compatible for net zero going ahead, or what is this big thing about 450, and also is it achievable in the next 8 years? What are your thoughts on that?
Jayashree, it's tough. I mean, if you look at India's 450 gigawatt target and you compare it to China right now, Avantika, correct me if I'm right, if I'm wrong, it's 1200 gigawatts, right, by 2030? Renewable RE target for China?
Yes, that's right, in their NDC.
In the NDC, and India is talking about 450 gigawatts. Yeah. But if you look at it in terms of, we don't have enough data in terms of what will be India's energy trajectory. The 450 gigawatts, what does it translate into emissions, energy contribution in 2030? But whatever data we have, it basically tells us that a 450 gigawatt target is substantial. There is no doubt that in terms of our energy trajectory, it is substantial. Now, whether it puts us on a 1.5 degree pathway or not, I don't know. There isn't enough detail on this. There isn't enough data on this for me to make a statement either for it or against it. We need much more data and good data from India. And that was really why I put my last slide out, that India needs to take climate change as an issue on which it starts putting out its plan for climate change, not in terms of 1.5 degrees, not in terms of targets, but in terms of the co-benefit. And that's when we'll understand how does the 450 target actually fit into the energy future of India, and in terms of how much will be generated from non-fossil fuel. Because 450 gigawatt target, Jayashree, also remember, is a target only for new renewables. It is for wind and solar. Whereas the target we have given to UNFCCC right now is a non-fossil fuel target. And a non-fossil fuel target includes hydel as well. So it's also important to look at it from another point of view, is how much of it is installed capacity and how much of it is generation. Because in terms of generation, the new solar actually generates much lower than, say, fossil fuel for installed capacity. So there's a lot of details that need to be worked out before we can say so. But yes, I think India's target for 450 is important. And will it meet it or not? I think it's a lot to do with both our intention, but also finances. Right now, solar is having a huge problem in India because of the cost of capital. The cost is very high of initial capital. We are not getting enough loans in India because the risk is seen to be too high in India. So the cost of capital to India is very high. Which is then making the cost of installation high. And you have probably read that solar prices will go up, and that is going to make it even more difficult for them to be able to sell to the grid. So there are major challenges. and these will need to be fixed for 450. Now, whether India should get additional finance and technology transfer is for India to put forward in its plan going forward. What I think we miss in India is not the denial of climate change, but the denial of climate change framing. And this is why, to me, it's time India accepted that climate change is real. We have not contributed in the past, but we will act for the future. And to act for the future, we will put out a plan which is in our own self-interest. And that's where we will put out these details. We don't have these details yet. Because every time we put out these details, we will think, oh, but we are being pushed into a 1.5 degree trajectory, or these details will become part of the plan that we will have to submit to UNFCCC. I think we need to move out of that. We need to say very clearly that we are leaders in climate change and we will act.
Right. Simran, can we unmute Simran now?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Simran.
Okay, I just had two questions. One was, you had said that India's climate change strategy should be with co-benefits. So I was hoping you could explain a little bit more what you mean by that, by co-benefits. The other thing I wanted to know a little bit more about was how these carbon markets work and how emissions are traded.
Okay, first, the second question, carbon markets are not in operation today. They were there for the Kyoto Protocol, and that's when you had the clean development mechanism and a global carbon market was set up. But as we have explained, those were for, that market was designed to capture the cheapest emission reduction targets. And as a result of it, it really became a market which didn't bring about major climate change benefits. So the carbon market is going to be designed at COP26 now, and that is why we are saying it needs to be designed differently, not designed in the Kyoto Protocol CDM way. As far as co-benefits are concerned, Simran, maybe it's a discussion for another day because I'll need to take a lot of time to explain it. But clearly, as environmentalists, we know that we need to act on air pollution. We need to act on resource efficiency. We need to act on finding ways in which we can actually reduce our environmental degradation. Now, this is where we can also do things differently, which the world has not done. We have still not built all our energy system. We have still not built all the houses that we have to build. We have still not constructed, all our cities have not been urbanized or motorized as yet. We have still not built all our industry. So we can have a pathway which is different. Now, the pathway that is different will also work for us. I mean, let me give you a clear example. You know, CSC does a lot of work on air pollution in Delhi. Now, in air pollution in Delhi, there are three major reasons why there are pollution. One, vehicles. Now, if you were to actually think about how you can move people and not vehicles, you would deal with local air pollution. You would also reduce the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So you would actually move people into public transport, which is not being anywhere else in the world, but it would also help you for local air pollution. If you were to, the second main reason is the use of coal in our cities, both in thermal power plants as well as in small boilers, use of coal in industry. If we stop the use of coal in industry, it is going to be a major benefit for us in terms of air pollution. It will also electrify India's economy, energize it to become towards clean sources. That would be in our co-benefit, okay? The third major cause for pollution is really the whole issue of people who do not have access to energy still, and they still use biomass fuel for cooking. Women who use biomass fuel for cooking are exposed to very dirty emissions, which they have to breathe. So if we could move them to cleaner sources, you could actually make sure that they don't go the fossil fuel route, but they leapfrog to cleaner sources. So I think there are a lot of opportunities like this, Simran, that we could actually put forward in a proposal, which would say, this is for our own self-interest, but it will also help the world combat climate change.
I think that's quite succinct, I would say. Now we had a question from Neil also. Neil, can you unmute yourself, or Sukanya, can you unmute Neil, please? Neil Kamal.
He should be able to.
Yeah, Neil.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
that's me.
First of all, appreciations for very nice and deep thought presentation. So while mentioning CBDR, as you have said that India need to act in self-interest. So my question is, are we doing that? Is it not in interest to clean our thermal power generation? Many times deadlines have been extended for FGD and other clean norms. The companies and the public sector plants are not adhering to the timelines. In such situation, how we could safeguard the self-interest and what further needs to be done? And apart from that, what about the progress on the renewables? Though some constructive things have been done, as you have answered about the 450 targets while answering to Jayashree's question.
Neil, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I cannot say differently. India is not doing enough in its self-interest. There is no doubt. You and I know, and you have been writing about it. We have been talking about it, how the 2015 emission standards for thermal power plant were to be implemented by 2017, how they were extended to 2022. By Supreme Court, and how the government of India has further diluted these, the Ministry of Environment and Forests, by not only extending the timeline, but also saying that you can continue to pollute if you pay a penalty. And the penalty has been kept lower than the cost of installation of the FGD or other emission technologies. So clearly we're not acting in self-interest. But that is why I think it is important for us to recognize that climate change is real. Climate change does require a country like India to act, and it will act, but it will act in self-interest. And that's the framing, Neil, that I think is important, because otherwise we are constantly in this battle and we are not getting further to say, what does a country like India do? Because we are not responsible for the stock of greenhouse gases. Under no circumstances can you equate India and China. The numbers are stark. And there is no way the world can say, you get onto the table and shut down your coal-based power plants. You come up with a peaking year. You can't say that, because the rest of the world has still not done so. So I think it's important for India to move away from this and to say, we are today saying to you, make equity the basis of negotiations, accept it, don't deny it. But then we are also saying to you that we have a framing which is for our own self-interests. These are the core benefits under which we will act. This is the money that we will spend, because these are cheap options. We will spend ourselves, but these costs are expensive, and we need you to pay for these so that we can make the transformation. So what I'm really saying is that India needs a plan for climate change, not because it is being bullied by the rest of the world, but because it is in its own self-interest.
Thank you.
Okay, Suparno?
Yeah, ma'am. I'm just.
I think we have exhausted the questions.
We don't have any more hands up, at least. So
Yeah, I think that
I'm
is.
just checking if we have anything on the other platforms. Sukanya, will you just see if
Yes, I'll check.
people are also live streaming?
And then Avantika, if you want to add anything to what I have been raving and ranting, if you want to add anything, I'm sorry I took up all the time, but please, if you want to add anything to what I have said, that would be good.
Sure, I think you've covered everything for now. If there are any other questions, we can take a look.
So Suparno, going forward, I think if you could also tell everyone, what are we planning to do now for COP, and how do we plan to keep this going?
Right. So to begin with, today's discussions, it's basically a press briefing. So we are going to put out a briefing note, which will encapsulate all the things that have been there, have been presented till now, including the call for action as well. And we have everything, all the information and all the, the content that was just being discussed. They're all up on the website. CSC and Down to Earth, they are going to be doing a daily analysis and daily updates on what is happening on the ground at COP, which will be projected on the Down to Earth website. So please keep visiting us and sort of taking a look at what is going on. Avantika is going to be in Glasgow along with some of you who are going to be there. That's how we are hoping to, and it's going to be a daily update. So please be in touch and please sort of keep on looking at us. I don't think there is anything important on the other streams that we are, other platforms that we are looking at. No more questions there. So yeah, Sunita ji, you want to add on something?
No, Suparno, I think this is the beginning. This is the start of this conversation. There's a lot more that's going to happen as the heat builds up for COP. And we wanted to put some of these things on the table because it's important for people to understand. But the magazine issue is going to be free downloadable.
Yes,
so look at it. We'll also put the booklet out. So please take a look at it.
Sukanya has shared the links on the chat. So just
good.
So then shall we sort of conclude this?
Yeah, I think we can wrap up. So I think thank you everyone, and thank you, and we will keep you informed as we go ahead. Thank you. Thank you.